Shailendra Mohan has joined another institute, and Dr. R.P. Deshpande wasn't well, and I have taken an office and have just moved my house today, and so a lot of confusion, and that is why we have not been able to be in touch. So please forgive us for all the confusion. Friends, it's a real privilege for us to listen to Professor Salikoko Mufwene. It is interesting to note that most of the areas of his research, and of course a very significant contribution to linguistic research, are of interest to us as well, and they're very close to our heart. His concern, his interest and account of English, the spread of English in the world, and his interest in evolution, language evolution, are of great interest to us. I was especially fascinated to learn about the way he approaches his language evolution. Professor Mufwene, if I have understood him well, Professor Mufwene believes that language evolution is determinative. It has to happen because individuals want it that way. The individuals interact and they support language evolution. My own take on this is that not only is there ecology, but also there is actually grammatical embedding as such in our knowledge of language, which makes it possible for language to evolve. For example, if we just think of the cognitive advantage of a grammar which is without exception, of a grammar which can be acquired from one generation to another, by another generation, as it is, no variation, no change, the grammar then would appear to be extremely simple, but human beings nowhere in the world go for that kind of grammar. All grammars have exceptions. All grammars have irregularities. I think we as species have built that way. If Professor Mufwene prefers no variation, if there are no irregularities, then human beings will probably look inward and be individualistic and probably show no interest in the world outside them. But that's not the way things have to be. So, in spite of the cognitive complexity, we still go for variation and irregularity. So what I believe in is that there is a complement to the ecology within our linguistic knowledge. I am truly fascinated to be able to listen to Professor Mufwene, and I look forward to listening to him. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Pandey, for inviting me and for welcoming me. And I'm so glad, very happy to be able to talk to you. We have to start with some technical problems, unfortunately. I have never used Google Meet before, so I'm going to need some help. Let me open my presentation. And okay, to open my PowerPoint. Okay, I'm not finding my PowerPoint. Excuse me. Yeah.
Did you open your PowerPoint?
The PowerPoint is on.
Okay, that should work. That should work.
Okay.
Yeah. Voilà, si je vois ton PowerPoint.
It's not, it's on the screen here, they don't see it.
एडिशनल शनिवार होता है शनिवार नंतर एडिशनल एक चॅप्टर दिलं भेटले तुला संडे 5 तारीख है की हाँ पुढचा सॅटर्डे किंवा संडे 5
So you can make it maybe half screen.
Okay.
That would.
I have to exit full screen. All right. And still, I have a problem with seeing the navigating. Okay. Maybe I should stop sharing and start again. And that way. Okay. And okay. Okay, now I can navigate. So, can I continue? You hear me?
Yes, you're clear, sir.
Okay, thank you. So, the title of my lecture is What do evolutionary linguistics, what do evolutionary linguists investigate? And we have to start by explaining some of the terms that I use here. And the convenient starting point is, what is evolutionary linguistics? Evolutionary linguistics is a term that has been coined by some of us that work on language evolution.
Hello.
Pattern on evolutionary biology to suggest that we do more or less the same kind of research that people do in evolutionary biology, only focusing on language evolution. And in order to do this, we have to show that language has some of the properties that an that a biological species has, which would justify applying a biological evolutionary approach to language. And the conditions are variation in a population, and we think of languages as populations simply because any language involves several individuals to use. Okay? In linguistics, we speak of idiolects, and a language is a population of idiolects. Another prerequisite for evolutionary theory is heredity. Heredity that has to do with transmission from one generation to another generation. And in language, that transmission is essentially horizontal. from people that speak already to people that are learning to speak, or from people that sign to people that are learning to sign. And another prerequisite is differential transmission. And differential transmission has to do with the fact that there is really no perfect replication in language. Nobody speaks exactly like another person. Nobody signs exactly like another person. There are several reasons. Our perceptions are not identical. Our capacity to reproduce what we have perceived varies from one person to another. Okay? But the important thing here is that whereas in evolutionary biology people has capitalized on transmission by mating, in language as in culture we are talking about transmission through learning. And this is learning by inference. There is really no teaching. The only thing we have is the model. And then we emulate the model until where we get to speak or where we get to sign. And evolution of what we are learning and or change in the structure of what we are learning. But we are also dealing with changes in the vitality of languages. In biology, people speak of endangered species. In linguistics, we speak of language endangerment. There are languages that are endangered. That is, languages that people may stop speaking because they are shifting to another language. And we would like to explain under what conditions this kind of shift happens. And so what we have to start thinking about here is that languages are comparable to species in biology, but don't think of animal species. You have to think of the practice. The interesting thing is that we are at the same time hosts and shapers of languages. Hosts in the sense that we are learning from, that is what we have to talk about now. So in linguistics we say ecology rolls the dice. And part of that ecology lies in our anatomy. It lies in our brain, what our brain can do and what our anatomy can do. There is a broader interpretation of ecology that also includes the environment, especially social environment in which we live, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk especially about the ecology that consists of our anatomical structures and our mental capacity. And we have to come with a story of evolution that is consistent with this representation here. There is something that is awful if you have noticed, and this is a representation that reflects the 19th century when Europeans were colonizing other people, and they produced the impression that the whole humankind is whitening. That is not happening. There's always diversity, there's still diversity, and there are various forms of diversity that are still emerging in this evolution, especially as people of different races interbreed. There's something else that is ridiculous in it. It's like evolution is associated only with the male gender, and that is not the case. We should know that. So we set it aside. We have to look at the shape of the human body. When the human person, humans first, the hominids, moved around more or less like chimps, and then they became bipedal, and they started to use tools, and that is the kind of evolution that we want to pay attention to And then there are a number of questions that we have to ask. Suppose that if you see my pointer here, that is the Homo sapiens, and this is supposed to be Homo erectus. And if you look at the shape of the head and the neck, there are enormous similarities, but for some reason, it appears that Homo erectus didn't speak, but Homo sapiens is the one that invented language about 200,000 years ago. Could be 300,000 years ago, could be 150,000 years ago. That's all a matter of speculation. But the story that evolutionary linguists have to produce must be consistent with evolutionary biology in the way that they have spoken about the evolution, the phylogenetic emergence of mankind. Okay, and evolutionary linguists are not necessarily linguists. There are people that do evolutionary linguistics that are psychologists, that are anthropologists, that are neurologists, and evolutionary linguistics is an interdisciplinary research area, and we get several disciplines to bridge with each other so that we can come up with some plausible hypotheses contrary to, say, philosophers in Antiquity who didn't have the advantage of knowing as much as we do now about Homo sapiens. And we have to come up with hypotheses that are consistent with the different stages of the phylogenetic emergence of mankind, and how we went from having no language to having means of communication that we call languages. And we have to highlight the significance of the anatomical evolution. So we can say, for instance, chimps cannot speak because the pharyngeal structure is not like ours. But when we compare Homo erectus with Homo sapiens, then we have to come up with a different kind of explanation. Could it be that the brain structure of Homo erectus was not exactly like the brain structure of Homo sapiens, and that could make a whole lot of difference. And other people have said that when you look at a chimp, the chimp can actually make some phonetic sounds like E, U, A, but the chimp cannot produce the kind of syntax that a human being can. And when I speak of syntax here, I'm talking just about combinatorics. We have the capacity to combine different sounds into different words. Like D-O-G, you can say dog, or you can say God, okay? D-A-B, you can say dad, but you can also say bad, and things like that. And a chimp is not capable of that. And when you think of the vocabularies of our languages, that is precisely how we went, by being able to combine sounds in different ways so that each combination corresponds to a different word. So, in other words, the evolution of the hominin anatomical structure is very important in the evolution of language as a means of communication. And the evolution of the brain is also very important. And then there is something that I'm going to introduce now. Is the conception of language as technology. And it's an interesting technology whereby the brain domesticated the rest of the anatomy. And instead of the brain, we should actually speak of the mind. That the mind gets in control and decides what to do with the tongue, with the teeth, which are the parts that we need to produce the sounds when we speak. So at some point, I speak of languages as communication technology produced through the domestication of the hominin anatomy by the mind. And you look here at the kind of phylogenetic structure, actually including also the lungs. The lungs are the engines that pump the air that goes through the throat, and when it passes the throat, through the throat we produce voice at the larynx, the Adam's apple, and then when it gets to the mouth and the nose, all we do is use our masticatory organs, the organs that we are endowed with for eating and breathing. And we exact them for a new purpose, that of producing sounds. And then that's how we can speak. And how did that happen? Those are the questions that we have to answer. The next thing is that we look at the brain, and now we have to answer the question of why Homo erectus couldn't speak. That's what we assume. It could be that Homo erectus was already capable of producing some sounds that we call phonetic sounds, but Homo erectus couldn't combine them to produce words in the cortex. That during the transition from the mutation from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, our cortex became thicker. And the cortical structure made a whole lot of difference in what we can do in terms of syntax, syntax of sounds, syntax of words, syntax of phrases. All that is particularly important. And other neurologists have come up with another hypothesis that the shape of the brain itself, going from something that is rather oval to something that is globular, made a whole lot of difference in our capacity to develop languages. So, this is part of the answer to the question, what do evolutionary linguists investigate? And then we have to deal with other issues. We all assume that the cradle of mankind is in Africa, that Homo sapiens emerged in Africa and then dispersed out of there. And the problem is we really don't have any fossils for language. And the only fossils that are available are those that are discovered by paleoanthropologists. And the fossils of Homo sapiens have been found especially in East Africa. But things are changing now. There are people that say have identified fossils of Homo sapiens in Morocco and elsewhere in North Africa. And realistically, we have to think of small colonies of Homo sapiens in different parts of Africa. And now, this is another representation of places where you can find traces of Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago. And there is another hypothesis where the real center was in Botswana, and then everything dispersed from there, southward, eastwards, and so forth. But then there are still questions that we have to address. And the first question is, given the size of Africa, and given how dispersed the different bands of Homo sapiens were in different places, can we entertain the hypothesis of monogenesis? This question comes up because we usually speak of the evolution of language. Very few people speak of the evolution of languages. And when we speak of the evolution of language, that becomes ambiguous. In one sense, we are suggesting that there was one proto-language, and from that proto-language, different languages have emerged. How could that have happened? If we all spoke the same language, how can we explain the speciation, that is diversification of that proto-language into so many different languages, to the point that today around the world we speak of about 7,000 different languages. You have to take that number with a grain of salt, because nobody really knows how many different languages are spoken around the world. And this question is also relevant because we also know that language was invented to solve a particular problem, that the problem is a communication problem. But in reality, in life, we usually come up with alternative solutions to the same problem. So there is really no solid evidence for thinking of monogenesis as the only possible explanation. Okay. But we can also say when we speak of the evolution of language, we are not really thinking about one single language. We are just focusing on the common properties of the different languages spoken around the world. And there are a number of properties that are shared by all the different languages. For instance, for spoken languages, they are all linear. You cannot produce two sounds at the same time. You cannot produce two words at the same time. Everything is really linear. Okay? And in every language, the different elements of language fall into separate categories. Like we have nouns, we have verbs. In some languages, they also have adjectives and prepositions and so forth. And so things really fit well into some sort of system. And those are the properties that we have in mind when we speak of the evolution of language. So why should we entertain the hypothesis of polygenesis? Because if the different bands of Homo sapiens live in different parts of Africa, and they had all reached a stage of evolution when it was unavoidable for them to produce languages, then it is very likely that the languages they produced were not really identical in form and were not really identical in structures. Okay. And so these are serious questions that we have to address. And for instance, a lot of linguists now think that what matters in the research on the evolution of language are the different languages that we speak. But Berwick and Chomsky, in their book published in 2016, say, no, we should focus mostly on universal grammar. Universal grammar, that is more or less the biological endowment for language, and that was really the trick. And for them, we shouldn't be thinking so much about languages as means of communication, or about universal grammar as a tool that came to enhance our thought capacity. So that remains controversial. And focusing on universal grammar and language and not languages, how Chomsky and Fitch came up with the hypothesis that the most central properties of human languages are recursion and merge. Recursion is like you can embed something in something else. When we say the table, the cup on the table in the kitchen. That represents recursion. Or the dog that chased the cat, that chased the mouse, that ate the cheese. That's an example of recursion. And the advantage of this is that we don't have to have so many different phrase structures, that is combinatoric patterns, and we can produce an infinite number of utterances by just applying the principle of recursion. Okay, and merge, it means combining smaller parts into larger parts, and that is what we do in sentences and in a construction such as the dog that chased the cat, that chased the mouse, that ate the cheese. You know, we have applied merge too. Okay. Now the question is, are these principles specific to language, or are they just part of our cognition in general? Isn't this question relevant to us? It is a very important one. If you have ever bought an assemble yourself kit, you have applied recursion several times in putting your piece of furniture together, and you have applied merge several times in putting that piece of furniture together. And when you look at representations like this that have nothing to do with language, you have recursion and you have merge. Look how the triangles in this large triangle are assembled. If you look carefully, there is repetition, there's recursion in applying the same principles. You can start with the big triangle, and then you make the smaller triangle in reverse, and then you do the same thing here, there, and then you keep doing it, and you can go as far as you can in reproducing this. That's recursion. In other words, these principles are not necessarily principles of language. There may be a reflection of the way that the mind works. Okay? And in fact, cognitively, it would be more economical if we operated that way. We don't want to go to what people have called phrenology, like you have a special mind for music, and you have a special mind for cooking, or you have a special mind for drawing and things like that. It's more efficient for the mind if some of the same principles could be extrapolated from one domain to another domain. And these are some of the things that we have to try to understand. Another question that comes up in evolutionary linguistics is gradualism versus saltationism. Gradualism, that means not all the parts of language started at the same time, that things came bit by bit, incrementally. And in my own hypothesis, I say that it is also possible that even the sounds, the phonetic sounds that we use in our vocabularies didn't start before the need to develop words, and words in order to identify individuals, in order to identify things, in order to identify animals, in order to identify how we feel. It would have been kind of strange to have sounds just for the pleasure of having sounds and saying a, e, o, p, t, for no reason. And there must have been a reason. And my hunch is that the inventory of phonetic sounds increased proportionally to the demand for more and more words, and the more words we needed, the more sounds we also found necessary in order to make distinctions between words. That's my hypothesis. And the other thing, when we think about the other aspects of language, why did we need words? Well, pointing isn't enough. We can point to individuals, but we cannot really point to how we feel. And we cannot point to what we think. And we cannot point to individuals that are absent. So naming things, naming ideas, naming feelings, that was a big milestone of a pointing, and that's important. And you do that also proportionate to what you can think about, what you feel some pressure to communicate, especially if you are planning things, for instance, for your survival. How do you communicate that to other people? And saltation has to do with whether or not all this started at the same time. I think it would have been overwhelming if everything started at the same time. But this is a matter of really figuring out how our hypotheses, how consistent our hypotheses are with regard, in relation to the anatomical evolution, our anatomical evolution, the evolution of our anatomy, and in relation to the evolution of our mind. And this is when we have to look at some things around us. So you look at a human child. The human child is equipped with a brain that is as capable as that of an adult. But the human child cannot do everything with that brain when they are still a child. They have to grow. Psychologists speak of maturation. There's cognitive maturation, and there's also physical maturation. And we can also look at the protracted evolution of mankind in those terms. Things that we didn't need to communicate about, and the things that we needed to communicate about later, because our cognitive capacity had improved to that extent. Okay. And then this is also where we deal with whether or not all languages have to be structured in identical ways. What we know in reality is that all languages have nouns and verbs, but there are languages that don't have articles. There are languages that don't have adjectives. There are languages that don't really have prepositions, although they have another element that is called connective. There are languages that don't have affixes. In other words, we have had different ways of solving the problem of communication, and we didn't have to develop our linguistic technologies in identical ways. Okay. And when it comes to sentences, there are some languages that favor close subordination. I told you to go, I told you, and to go is the part of subordination. But there are some languages that prefer predicate serialization. And you hear something like, I tell you go. Okay. And what's the difference? Well, both systems manage to convey ideas, but they package information in different ways. And this is just reality. Because in other aspects of culture, we also have not solved our existential problems in identical ways. Think, for instance, how we cook. The basic principle is that we have to treat food items before we eat them, because we can eliminate elements that are toxic, because we don't want to poison ourselves. But past that, what happens, we have developed various culinary practices around the world. Okay. And that is also something that is worthwhile considering. That variation is important. We are equal, but we are not identical. And that is something, I'm saying this not to encourage discrimination against people. I'm saying this so that we can tolerate variation from one population to another population. Okay. And so the fundamental question here, especially if you are Cartesian, why has the same mind that mankind is endowed with not structured languages in identical ways? And for me, the answer seems to lie in the fact that naturally we don't really solve problems in identical ways in our lives. Okay. So I have already addressed the question, why don't chimps speak or sign, and why did Homo erectus probably not speak? But what I have to highlight here is the fact that there is a biological dimension in the evolution of language, but there is also a cultural dimension in the evolution of language. The biology consists in the emergence of the right anatomical structure and the right mental capacity in order to produce language. And the cultural part lies in the fact that different populations have developed their communication technologies in different ways. Okay? Actually, I'm reminded of what has happened today when we were trying to connect. I'm accustomed to Zoom, and you guys are accustomed to Google Meet. And, different people came up with similar inventions, but they are not alike. But they managed to accomplish the same thing, and in this particular case, long-distance visual communication, which has worked so far. Okay, and I wanted to show that, we do this, and I'm from Africa, third world, and I thought of tools that people might consider primitive. Think of arrows. Every population that has hunters invented arrows, but when you compare the arrows, they don't all have the same shape. And the consequences of an arrow piercing the body of an animal are probably different depending on the shape. So this is something that we have to live with. Look at these more complete arrows. So they all are consistent with principles of aerodynamics. However, look at how the feathers are shaped in order to balance the trajectory of the arrow. They change from one population to another. And this is probably how we have to think about variation across languages. Why languages are not all organized or structured in the same way, although they were intended to solve a communication problem, their communication problems within their respective communities. So let's conclude with the historical fold of language evolution. So there's a phylogenetic side of language evolution that protracted emergence from non-language to the kinds of languages that we speak today. We don't know how many different phases we went through, but we also assume that things probably evolved incrementally, gradually. But there's the historical part. Now that we have the modern languages that we speak, there are still changes that happen. And why do these changes happen? Okay. And the first reason is learning by inference. When you learn by inference owing to variation in perception and in the capacity to reproduce what we have perceived, we wind up with imperfect replication. And this is unlike the replication of genes in biology. Although in biology there is a trick, you have the recombination of genes, and the recombination of genes is what makes us different, one individual from another, even between siblings. Okay. But also we come up with new ideas and we innovate. And then after we innovate, other people copy us, and through the copy, things also get to change. And we also communicate according to smaller social networks. So more and more people now in linguistics speak of communities of practice rather than language communities. And the real action is in these social networks. And the networks overlap. And people carry things across networks, and in the end, you have a language that is in the state of flux, that is always changing as we communicate, and that is how we notice, for instance, 10 years later, that there are some new elements in our languages, or that there are certain things that we don't say anymore in our languages and so forth. That is part of the explanation. And another reason is population movements, population contacts, and how they get to change languages. And we become aware of this when we consider empires, for instance. And one classic empire is the Roman Empire. And the Romans colonized a great deal of the world around the Mediterranean, but most of that in Europe. And in continental southwestern Europe, the contact of Latin with the Celtic languages produced what we now call the Romance languages. And an explanation for that is the substrate languages. The model here is on geology. The substrate languages, the languages that preceded Latin, were the Roman Empire to Latin, influenced Latin, so that after the Romans had left, and the speakers of Latin were the Celts that had been colonized, they modified Latin, and Latin became so different that it evolved into French, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and so forth. And we can see that in the way that English has spread around the world today, and in different parts of the world, is English is spoken differently. That's because of substrate influence. But there's also an element, a phenomenon known as superstate influence. In parts of the world where we have been colonized, we have borrowed a number of things from the colonizing power. And so we use words that have been borrowed from the languages of the colonized. And there are also cases where just a language of a comparable level comes in contact with another language of a comparable level, and they influence each other. So we kind of, I don't know whether I should say contaminate each other, but whenever languages come in contact, they tend to influence each other, and those influences lead to change. You have probably heard of particular languages called Creoles and Pidgins. And we have typically treated them as anomalous evolution. Actually, in the way I do my research on Creoles and Pidgins, I think that Creoles especially are reminding us of how other languages change under contact situations, under substrate influence, superstrate influence, and substrate influence. That when languages come in contact, we create these new linguistic feature pools, and as we interact with each other, we make selections, and eventually we wind up changing our languages, making them sound different from what they did before, and we package information sometimes in ways that are different from the way they used to be transmitted in earlier stages. Okay. And speaking of population movements and contacts, do language families justify positing what linguists call proto-languages? The idea of proto-languages is probably what took us to assume, according to some people, that there was a proto-language from which all other languages have evolved. And the proto-languages here we think, for instance, of Proto-Bantu, Proto-Semitic, Proto-Indo-European, as if there was one Proto-Indo-European language and every other language that is called Proto-Indo-European can ultimately be traced back to that language. Well, that's not a sure thing. And this is something that can resonate to the Indian part of the world, where, as I understand, people have not accepted the hypothesis that the homeland of Proto-Indo-Europeans is in Anatolia. And with current findings in genetics, it's really controversial whether there was really a Proto-Indo-European population in one place, or whether we are dealing with strands of population that started part in South Asia or in Indo-Aryan area, and part of it in Nordic Europe, and the other part in the area of where the young Maya populations have been positive. So the idea of a proto-language itself becomes questionable, and we don't really know what has gone on. We are just reopening the books here on traditional genetic linguistics. I don't have an answer for that. And then we come to the question of endangered languages comparable to endangered species. And this too is the outcome of population movements and population contacts. And when we think of languages as technologies, it's like when we meet and compare the different technologies, I'm sure, for some people they are thinking, should we go for Google Meet or should we go for Zoom? Which one is easier to use? Which one is more practical, and so forth? And we don't know how we make these choices. And the choices are contingent on various ecological factors, including costs and so forth. And when it comes to languages, well, it's not whether or not a language is better built than another language. This is where we come to depend very much on ecological factors that are outside our anatomies and our minds. That's the socio-economic structures in which we live. And considerations such as which language is going to help me get build fortune, build some wealth, or build political power is an important consideration. Which language is going to enable me to communicate with a larger number of people? That's an important consideration, and so forth. Okay. And the question in terms of technologies is, are all technologies equal? Do we like all solutions to the same problem. If you are a teacher, you know what I'm talking about. You taught a subject matter to your class, and then at the end of the class you give them a homework, and next week they come, the student gives you answers to your questions, and you like some and you don't like some others. It's not that the answers that you don't like are completely wrong, and it's not that the answers that you like are perfect. It's a matter of preference relative to what you are focused on. So more or less the same kinds of things happen with languages. However, when it comes to languages, our deliberations are not necessarily conscious. And sometimes we don't really have any control over the choices that we have to make. It could be that we are evolving in situations where we don't have the choice of using one of the 2 or 3 languages that we know. And if we find ourselves so many times in these kinds of situations, our knowledge of the language or languages that we don't know, the language or languages that we don't get to practice becomes rusty. And when that knowledge becomes rusty, at some point when we want to go back to those languages, we have difficulties using them, and then we just give up. This is how languages become endangered. And of course, in linguistics, there is a movement now to revitalize endangered languages. And sometimes the question arises of whether it is worth the engagement. And the question is, are the effects of language endangerment on speakers or signers similar to those of species endangerment on us? If we misuse our natural ecologies, we make our natural ecologies deleterious to us. If we kill too many of some animals that can balance, if we kill a lot of animals that can affect the balance of power in our ecologies, and that can affect our survival. The question is our survival equally affected by the loss of languages that we no longer speak? The answer is not straightforward. And I characterize all these questions here as wicked questions. There are no clear answers to them, and we have to keep working on them. And so I wanted to give you a synopsis of what evolutionary linguists do, and that is the picture, a very short summary. I thank you for your attention.
So thank you for giving us this wonderful talk. Will you agree to take a few questions if any of our young students would like to ask?
Of course, not just young students, anybody who wants to ask questions.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, please you can ask. Professor Sonal Kulkarni, do you want to ask some questions? We can start with you. Yes, anyone?
Good evening, I'm Anirban Sarkar. I just want to ask something. Can I?
Yes.
Yeah. Sir, thank you for your lecture. Just one thing that I would like to ask. You were talking something about ecology. Like in the very last slide of your presentation, you were talking about like how they are not directly. I mean, the relation that you're trying to build with this endangered language and then the species that you're talking about, that in case of this language, it's not directly related. I just want a little bit of clarity on that, if you can possibly give, like how it is not directly influencing on this language actually.
Okay, one of the reasons why I said it is that the subject matter of language endangerment is a wicked question is that when you put things in perspective, there is injustice in what is happening. So if you speak Hindi and I speak Lingala, so suppose there are two groups. There are 10 of us speaking Lingala and there are 20 of you speaking Hindi. And we are in the same place. And you have economic power and we don't have economic power. And in this imaginary population structure, the economy is operating in Hindi. So we Lingala speakers have to learn Hindi in order to find jobs. But in this population structure, we can socialize together across linguistic boundaries. And we can form families across linguistic boundaries. And so somehow things work in such a way that Lingala speakers don't have many opportunities of speaking Lingala anymore among themselves. And this population evolves into a population speaking only Hindi. But aside from the fact that Lingala speakers have lost their language, they are surviving well as long as society is equitable, is fair, and so forth. Okay? And this is different from a situation where there would be discrimination about who gets a good job. That a person from one ethnic group cannot get a job, regardless of whether or not they have learned the other language. So that is difficult. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to take into account as we deal with language endangerment. On the other hand, you know, when we speak of species endangerment, the story is kind of different. That there are certain animals, if we kill them all, then the natural ecology is affected. There are certain plants that we don't like around us that will grow extensively, and because those plants grow extensively, they are going to kill other plants that we eat. And so the way in which we deal with endangered species is not necessarily the way in which we should deal with endangered languages. That is the message I want to give. And sometimes, sometimes because I spoke of technologies, we love the technologies that our communities have created. But sometimes for practical reasons we say, I think the neighbor's technology works better than mine, so I'm going to use that particular technology. And if every one of us does that, then before we know it, our own technology disappears. And there is really no price to pay for that except in terms of, you know, our emotional attachment to what we have given up. So this is what I want to say.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
So there is a question from our Vice Chancellor, Professor Pandey. if language is technology and writing too is technology, what could be the reasons for writing to have evolved so late in our evolution?
Well, that's why we have to think about the protracted evolution of mankind anatomically and mentally. So there must have come a time when it was necessary to transmit information in a deferred way. No. So not instantly. And we see this, for instance, in the cave paintings. So we assume actually that languages must have emerged about the same time as people started drawing cave paintings. Because cave paintings, you leave information to which you can come back to, or you leave information that other people coming after you can see. Okay. And when it comes to writing systems, we have to go to the invention of agriculture. That's about 10,000 years ago. And with the invention of agriculture came the production of surplus. And the surplus, we didn't want it to go to waste. We wanted to trade it with other populations. Okay? And here you bring the element of power. Not everybody was capable of controlling the surplus. So you hire people to go and trade your surplus. And you want to keep track of what they sold and the profit that you made and so forth. And here comes the invention of writing. And originally, writing was developed for commercial purposes, just bookkeeping. And then from bookkeeping, we discovered you could do other things. You can tell a whole story. And then the writing system developed. It evolved to become more and more complex and so forth. And in the writing systems, as technologies, you find that variation too. So the people that invented the alphabetical system and the people that invented the logographic system, for instance. Okay. The alphabetical system is very much patterned on the way we speak in a linear way. The logographic system is patterned differently that on the model of concepts that you have in the mind, and you represent those concepts. And the syntax for these systems are different. The syntaxes of these systems are different. And there's also the syllabaries, where is patterned on the sounds that not on the sounds, on the syllables that you produce, and you put syllables together and so forth. But it took so long because we didn't develop everything in our cultures at the same time, and the pressure to give information in a delayed form didn't really arise until people started practicing long distance trade. So, I hope you can make sense of that explanation.
Yes. There is one question from Yogesh from Affect Its Nature as in making or changing its social and cultural perspective.
Well, there are various factors. An epidemic can endanger a language when it affects a large proportion of the population, and that population cannot survive on its own and has to go somewhere else in order to survive, and they are going to speak the language of the host population. It can be, a language can be endangered by a natural disaster. So suppose there is drought in one particular area and they are an agriculturalist or a farming population, and so they have to move out of their homeland and go somewhere else. And when they go somewhere else, they have to renegotiate the terms of coexistence with the host population, and they may lose their language if they are assimilated. It could be colonization, but colonization is really a broad term. It depends on what kind of colonization. The European colonization of the Americas and Australia and New Zealand was on the settlement model, where they intended to build the new Europes and impose their cultures and so forth and marginalize the indigenous people, and they turned indigenous populations into minorities, and they introduced new economic world orders, and the indigenous populations were were excluded from these new socioeconomic structures, and they were relegated to impoverished pieces of land. And so economically the reservations are not sustainable. So what happens? So now they have to move out of the reservations and join the dominant populations, and that means you have to operate in the language of the new socioeconomic structures. But when you also look in details, you find out that even among the colonists there was competition among the different languages. So in the United States, for instance, the German people of German descent don't speak German anymore. People of Italian descent don't speak Italian any longer. People of French descent, barely survive. People that still speak some French and so forth. So these are some of the reasons, and you can find all sorts of reasons why languages are endangered. In China, for instance, the Semitic expansion has been at the expense of non-Semitic populations, and the non-Semitic languages are endangered. Some of them are dead already. What is quite interesting from my point of view as an outsider to India, to Asia in general, I see in India a succession of different empires. And that is very interesting because the succession of the different empires in India didn't have the same effect as the Semitic imperial expansion in China. What is the magic in India that has not caused so much language endangerment when you take the coexistence of indigenous languages among themselves? So these are things that we still have to understand in evolutionary linguistics.
Tanushka Dasgupta, are you here?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So why don't you ask Professor your question?
Hello, ma'am. Hello, sir. It was a pleasure to listen to you. So, as we were talking about the anatomical structure and the evolution of from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, I wanted to know if it is possible for the evolution to occur as an exchange for our cognitive ability, that is memory, because I read a hypothesis by the primatologist Tetsuro Matsuzawa. He says that we could have traded our cognitive ability for language. I'd like to know your opinion on this.
You mean if we could have evolved to have a different kind of cognitive ability?
If we could have evolved and it was a need that we needed communication for that to happen, and we traded our cognitive ability for language to ever happen.
Well, that's a complicated story. I couldn't give you all the aspects of the problems in the kind of summary that I gave you. We have always shared our universe with other animals and with other beings. And we are not necessarily the most fit physically. If you compare us, for instance, to lions, to tigers, to elephants, and so forth, we are very vulnerable. But then we also realize that if we have better social organizations, we can survive. And we have survived essentially because we can cooperate among us. It starts with family units. Economically, family units are very significant because you have division of labor within the family. You can cooperate with each other in order to sustain yourselves. But we also realize that families, that's not enough. If you live in a village, you better be organized in some way because there are certain things that you have to do together as village members. But in order to be able to cooperate, you need to share your ideas. And you couldn't just share your ideas by looking at each other. And you couldn't just share your ideas in communicating in the ways that, for instance, we communicate with our pets. Okay? I often walk my dog and I see that the dog wants to communicate something to me, but the dog has to rely on the bark. And the dog has diversified barks. There are long barks, short barks, intense barks, and so forth. But these barks are not as explicit as linguistic communication. So we were under a lot of pressure evolutionarily to produce languages so that we can share our thoughts, so that we can plan things, so that we can remind people, other people that we live with, of things that we said in the past and things like that, or so that we can teach other people how to do things like drawing on the past and so forth. So the evolution of our communal lives becomes an important ecological factor in triggering the evolution of language. That's really what it is. So, and it takes that, excuse me, it takes that particular mind with that particular cortical structure to be able to solve this problem. Because I'm sure my dog is confronted with the same problem. How can I really get my father to do this for me? And it's a big challenge. And sometimes she finds solutions by doing tricks around me and so forth that are going to direct me to what she wants especially. But still, that's far away from what a human child would do by learning a language and telling me, Daddy, want something like that. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
So, Pooja, are you here?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so please go ahead and you can ask.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir. Thank you for the wonderful session. Yeah, so I wanted to ask, you have mentioned in your works, you have called language shifts as a benefits-driven social act. So, and like you mentioned in this lecture as well, the ecological factor. So I wanted to know for endangered languages, what kind of interventions should one take, if at all? Should documentation be a priority as opposed to interventions to try to save the language?
Documentation and revitalization are not the same thing. Documentation, you want to get all the information that you can gather on a particular language so that you can study it, for instance. revitalization takes more than documentation. First of all, when you revitalize a language, there may be people that speak it, except that they are a minority compared, or they are in a decreasing proportion compared to the larger population that could have been expected to speak it. So when you want to revitalize a language, you want to create conditions that are advantageous to the language. You want to create an ecology where people feel the need to speak their language. And at that point, things become more complicated. Like you have to empower that particular population economically so that they can find their language useful. Okay. That would be another solution, introduce segregation. And we don't like segregation, especially when it is unjust, when it is unfair. Okay. So it takes a whole lot to revitalize a language, and in many attempts have failed. And I think a good example is that of Irish in Ireland. For over 100 years, Irish schools have been teaching Irish to students. But the economic and political systems of Ireland operate in English. So for students, learning Irish is more or less like learning Latin. You know the grammar, you know the vocabulary, you can write a few things in Irish, but they don't speak it. So Irish has not really been revitalized. So that's my answer to your question.
Thank you, sir.
So as I see that there are not many more questions, on this note, I would like to request Dr. Shubhangi Kardile from the Linguistics department to give a brief introduction to our eminent scholar who just gave his lecture. Sorry, sir, we missed this introduction in the beginning because of some network issues, and till we have not yet come to the end, so we would like to have this introduction.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Thank you, sir, for your illuminating lecture. I would like to give a brief introduction to you, to all the listeners. Professor Salikoko Mufwene is the Edward Carson Waller Distinguished Service Professor at the Department of Linguistics, University of Chicago. His research interests are language evolution from a population genetics and ecological perspectives, development of creoles, language endangerment, colonialization, globalization, and language. His earlier work was also on semantics and syntax, especially in languages like English, Gula, African American English, Caribbean English Creoles, Bantu languages, especially Lingala, Kikongo, Kikasiti, Kinshasa, and National University of Zaire, Lubumbashi. He received his PhD in linguistics at the University of Chicago. His doctoral work was on semantic field versus semantic class. He started his teaching career at the University of West Indies, Mona in Jamaica. He also worked at the University of Georgia, Athens, before joining as a professor at the Department of Linguistics at the University of Chicago in 1991, where he is the Edward Carson Waller Distinguished Service Professor of Linguistics and the college. Professor Mufwene is also professor on the Committee on Evolutionary Biology, on the Committee on the Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science, and on the Committee on African Studies. Professor Mufwene is the founding editor of Cambridge Approaches to Language Contact, under which series so far 18 books have been published and 8 more are in the process of publication. In his career spanning over 4 decades, he has published extensively. He has authored and edited over 20 books and over 150 research papers and book chapters. Some of his publications, more recent publications, are Language Evolution, Contact, Competition and Change, Iberian Imperialism and Language Evolution in Latin America, Complexity in Language, Developmental and Evolutionary Perspectives, and Bridging Linguistics and Economics. Thank you once again, Professor Mufwene, for this talk. It was a privilege to listen to you. Thank you, sir.
I thank you for inviting me to speak to you.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, sir.
I'll say bye-bye now.
Yes.